This is the story of the Pacific Theater's deadliest battle, an 82-day engagement that killed more people than both atomic bombs combined and directly influenced President Truman's decision to use those weapons rather than invade Japan. Between 240,000 and 250,000 lives ended during the Battle of Okinawa, making it the worst battle of the Pacific War by nearly every measure. But determining the actual worst battle depends on which metric matters most: total deaths, civilian casualties, soldier suffering, or strategic pointlessness. We're examining 5 Pacific Theater battles today to understand why historians overwhelmingly consider Okinawa the worst, while also revealing why Manila represents the darkest chapter of civilian atrocity, and why Peleliu stands as the most tragic strategic miscalculation. These weren't just battles, they were catastrophes that revealed warfare's capacity for total dehumanization. Before diving into the battles themselves, we need to establish what worst actually means in warfare. Does it mean the sheer number of dead, the percentage of civilians killed, the suffering endured by soldiers, or the strategic futility of it all? Let me give you context with a comparison that'll frame everything ahead. Okinawa produced between 240,000 and 250,000 total deaths, including 12,500 Americans killed or missing, between 94,000 and 110,000 Japanese military deaths, and the staggering number of between 94,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians killed. That civilian death toll represents 1/4 to 1/3 of the entire population wiped out. Compare that to Manila, where 1,010 Americans died, 1,665 Japanese soldiers were killed, but over 100,000 Filipino civilians were murdered, not killed in crossfire, but systematically murdered in just 28 days. Total deaths reached somewhere between 117,000 and 123,000 in less than a month. Saipan produced around 54,000 total deaths, and Iwo Jima, the subject of that famous flag-raising photograph, killed between 45,000 and 48,000 people total. Peleliu, which we'll discuss in detail later, produced around 13,000 deaths, but carried the highest casualty rate of any amphibious assault in the Pacific. And that's where the numbers only tell part of the story. Military historian Hanson W. Baldwin witnessed Okinawa firsthand and called it the most ghastly corner of hell ever seen in the Pacific. This assessment came from a man who'd covered warfare across the entire theater, who'd seen everything the Pacific War had to offer. Okinawa stands alone in the sheer scale of destruction, and the Japanese had a name for it that tells you everything. They called it the Typhoon of Steel. Americans just called it hell and left it at that. April 1st, 1945 marked the beginning, Easter Sunday, when more than 60,000 American troops landed on the beaches. L-Day seemed almost too easy at first because the Japanese had pulled back from the beaches, luring American forces inland into a trap years in the making. What waited for them was the most sophisticated defensive system Japan had ever constructed, and Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima had abandoned the traditional strategy of defending at the beach and throwing banzai charges at American positions. His defense-in-depth system used Okinawa's natural terrain of ridges, draws, cliffs, and hundreds of limestone caves, connected by elaborate tunnel systems, turning the entire southern part of the island into a fortress. The Shuri line, anchored on ancient Shuri Castle, formed the centerpiece, with 3 parallel defensive lines featuring positions on reverse slopes protected from naval bombardment. Brilliant and deadly in equal measure, this system would make the next 82 days longer than any other sustained combat operation in the Pacific. The numbers that came out of those 82 days are almost incomprehensible when you see them laid out. American forces suffered approximately 49,000 to 50,000 battle casualties, more than any other Pacific operation, with 12,500 killed or missing among them. But here's something that drives home the nature of this battle. The U.S. Navy lost 4,907 sailors killed, which exceeded their wounded count of 4,974. More sailors died than were wounded, and if you understand anything about naval warfare, you know that's almost unheard of, caused primarily by kamikaze attacks that turned ships into floating coffins. The first major Kikusui kamikaze operation launched between April 6th and April 7th with 355 planes, and on April 7th alone, the Japanese sent the battleship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, on a one-way suicide mission with 3,700 sailors on board and only enough fuel for a one-way trip. Japanese military losses reached catastrophic levels, with between 94,136 and 110,000 soldiers killed, while an additional 24,000 were sealed in caves by American forces using explosives and flamethrowers. Many of those men starved to death in darkness, trapped underground while the battle raged above them, but the civilian casualties transform Okinawa from a military battle into something beyond comprehension, a humanitarian catastrophe that would echo for generations. Okinawa's pre-war population stood at approximately 300,000 civilians, and when the battle ended, between 94,000 and 150,000 of them were dead. The Cornerstone of Peace Memorial at Mabuni lists 149,634 Okinawan names as of 2023, with total names on that memorial reaching 246 when you include Japanese, American, and Allied forces. These civilians didn't just die in crossfire or from stray bombs, and that's what makes this so much worse. Many were caught in a psychological warfare campaign that convinced them Americans would rape, torture, and kill them without mercy, while Japanese soldiers distributed hand grenades to civilians with orders to commit suicide rather than surrender. March 28th saw 394 civilians kill themselves on Tokashiki Island after U.S. landings, before the main battle even began. At Chibichirigama Cave on April 2nd, 87 of 150 Okinawans committed suicide, including 47 children, and the youngest was just 2 years old. They used grenades, sickles, razors, ropes, and parents killed their children before killing themselves in scenes that still haunt the few who witnessed them. The Himayuri student nurses' tragedy epitomizes what happened to Okinawan civilians caught in this nightmare. On March 23, 1945, 222 female students aged 15 to 19 from Okinawan schools were mobilized after being told they would work in safe Red Cross hospitals, which turned out to be a complete lie. These teenage girls performed crude surgeries in cave hospitals instead, removing maggots from wounded soldiers' bodies while limited to 1 rice ball per day. June 18th brought their abrupt disbandment with orders to go home in the middle of total warfare with no safe place to go, and within 1 week, 117 of them were dead. White phosphorus attack killed 51 students in Ahara Cave on June 19th alone. Of the 240 students and teachers who were mobilized, 227 died before the battle ended. Let me put this in perspective that shows why Okinawa stands alone. The civilian death toll exceeded the combined deaths from both atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This single battle killed more civilians than the 2 weapons that ended the war. Physical conditions on Okinawa added another layer to an already nightmarish situation, and when the monsoon rains began in late May, the battlefield transformed into a morass where roads became impassable and mud literally sucked the boots off soldiers' feet. Eugene Sledge, a Marine whose memoir With the Old Breed became the definitive account of Pacific combat, described terrain that was part garbage dump and part graveyard. Unburied bodies decomposed in the mud around living soldiers who found their pockets full of maggots when they tried to sleep, while the stench became overwhelming and inescapable no matter where they moved. Sugarloaf Hill between May 12th and May 20th illustrates the grinding psychological warfare better than any other engagement. This 50-foot-high mound that Sledge described as an insignificant-looking hill cost the 6th Marine Division 2,062 killed and wounded, plus 1,189 combat fatigue cases in just 10 days of fighting for one small piece of ground. The 29th Regiment suffered 82% casualties and essentially ceased to exist as a fighting unit, wiped out for a hill nobody remembers. And this brings us to something that doesn't show up in casualty statistics, but was just as real. Okinawa produced more psychiatric casualties than any Pacific battle, with 26,000 documented cases of combat fatigue. The Marine Corps Gazette later noted that more mental health issues arose from the Battle of Okinawa than any other battle in the Pacific, and special field hospitals were inundated with over 3,000 patients suffering from what we'd now call PTSD. Okinawa was the only Pacific battle where both commanding generals were killed, which tells you something about how close the fighting got and how long it lasted. June 18, 1945, saw American Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. die from artillery fire while observing his troops from a forward position, making him the highest-ranking U.S. officer killed by enemy action in World War II. 4 days later, on June 22nd, Japanese Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima and his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, committed seppuku, the ritual suicide that Japanese officers chose when defeat became inevitable. Before he died, Ushijima gave a final order to Colonel Hiromichi Yahara that explained why one man needed to survive. If you die, there will be no one left who knows the truth about the Battle of Okinawa. Yahara survived and later wrote extensively about the battle, preserving the Japanese perspective that would have died with Ushijima otherwise. The battle officially ended on June 22nd, but the killing continued for weeks as American forces cleared out caves and sealed others, with Japanese soldiers still inside, trapped and left to die in darkness. Now, if we're measuring by total deaths, Okinawa stands alone. But if we're measuring by deliberate civilian atrocity and systematic murder, then the Battle of Manila represents something arguably even darker. From February 3rd to March 3rd, 1945, in just 28 days, Japanese forces systematically murdered over 100,000 Filipino civilians, approximately 1 in every 10 Manila residents. This wasn't collateral damage or civilians caught in crossfire. This was genocide with explicit orders and systematic execution. Here's what happened and why it stands apart from everything else. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the overall Japanese commander in the Philippines, had ordered Manila evacuated because he wanted to defend the mountains instead of the city, but Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi defied those orders completely. Commanding 17,000 Japanese defenders who fortified themselves in Manila, Iwabuchi received and distributed explicit instructions about the civilian population that American forces later captured. An official Japanese order stated it clearly without any ambiguity. All people on the battlefield, with the exception of Japanese military personnel, Japanese civilians, and special construction units, will be put to death. They followed those orders with systematic brutality that shocked even hardened American soldiers who'd seen combat across the Pacific. The 14th Corps Inspector General documented atrocities that, in his words, defy credence, and when an official military investigator uses language like that, you know what followed was beyond normal warfare. Japanese soldiers bayoneted infants after tossing them in the air, selected the 25 most beautiful women and girls aged 12 to 14 at the Bayview Hotel for mass rape, doused victims in gasoline and burned them alive, and ripped open the bellies of pregnant women. Fort Santiago saw between 600 and 4,000 men starved, tortured, and burned alive in the dungeons. At the German club, Japanese soldiers bayoneted children in front of their mothers, while one witness described a soldier placing a mutilated woman's severed breasts on his chest, as other soldiers laughed at the display. Japanese forces herded civilians into buildings, barred the doors, and set the structures on fire with families trapped inside. They executed priests, doctors, and nurses without distinction, destroyed hospitals while patients were still in their beds, and turned the capital into a slaughterhouse that lasted nearly a month. The 14th Corps Inspector General concluded that cannibals in the lowest strata of life could have pursued no crueler methods. And when you read the full reports, you understand that wasn't hyperbole. Manila's physical destruction matched the human toll in scale and brutality. 100% of the business district was destroyed. Every single building leveled or burned, while 80% of the southern residential district was razed to the ground. Over 4,000 city blocks required complete demolition after the battle ended, turning what had been called the Pearl of the Orient into rubble and ash. Manila became the second most devastated Allied capital of World War II, trailing only Warsaw, but unlike Warsaw, which was destroyed over years of occupation and uprising, Manila was destroyed in less than a month. The Intramuros siege at the end saw Americans breaching 40-foot-thick, 15-foot-high Spanish colonial walls with a 140-gun artillery barrage after Admiral Iwabuchi fortified the walled city as his final redoubt, holding 3,000 civilian hostages who he had no intention of releasing alive. Iwabuchi committed suicide on February 26th as American forces closed in, avoiding capture and trial for what he'd done. General Yamashita, who had ordered the evacuation that Iwabuchi ignored, was executed for war crimes on February 23, 1946, and his trial established the Yamashita Standard, holding commanders responsible for their subordinates' atrocities, even when they didn't order them directly. Now, let me tell you about Peleliu, because this battle represents something different from Okinawa's scale or Manila's atrocity. This is about soldiers who suffered and died for an objective that military historians now agree was strategically unnecessary. Peleliu lasted from September 15th to November 27th, 1944, spanning 74 days when it was predicted to last just 4 to 5. The 1st Marine Division was told they'd take this small coral island quickly, then move on to support MacArthur's Philippines campaign. But Admiral William Halsey had actually recommended canceling the operation entirely because Peleliu wasn't necessary. MacArthur and Nimitz proceeded anyway, and what happened next became the place where, in Eugene Sledge's words, "something in me died." Peleliu was a volcanic island covered in cement-hard coral where Marines couldn't dig foxholes because the coral was too hard to penetrate. They carried sand in buckets from the beaches to create makeshift sandbag shelters, while temperatures exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit day after day. And the water drums had previously stored gasoline and were inadequately cleaned, forcing troops to drink contaminated water while suffering severe dehydration. Sharp coral lacerated exposed skin, causing rampant infections that antibiotics couldn't keep up with, and men fought in conditions that seemed designed to break them physically before the Japanese even fired a shot. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, the Japanese commander, had pioneered the defense tactics that would later be used at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, after abandoning traditional banzai charges for a war of attrition designed to, in his words, bleed Americans white. Over 500 limestone caves connected by 18 kilometers of tunnels in Umurburgal Mountain gave him the perfect terrain to execute that strategy, and the Marines renamed it Bloody Nose Ridge for reasons that became obvious quickly. Peleliu produced the highest amphibious assault casualty rate in Pacific operations at over 40% of assault troops, and the 1st Marine Regiment suffered 54% casualties. The entire 1st Marine Division was rendered combat ineffective and wasn't used again until Okinawa 7 months later, pulled out of the line because they'd been destroyed as a fighting force. Between 1,989 and 2,143 Americans were killed, while between 10,695 and 10,900 Japanese defenders died, bringing total casualties to approximately 13,000 for both sides combined. And for what, exactly, what did those men die for? West Point's Lieber Institute concluded that Peleliu provided negligible strategic military advantage, meaning the island didn't need to be taken at all. Those men suffered and died for nothing, and Admiral Halsey had been right from the beginning when he recommended canceling the operation. That's why some veterans consider Peleliu the worst battle, not because of the numbers compared to Okinawa, but because of the futility. Over 2,000 Americans died because military leadership ignored the right recommendation and proceeded with an unnecessary operation. Before we move to the broader impact of these battles, we need to understand something that happened at both Okinawa and Saipan that was unprecedented in modern warfare: mass civilian suicide on a scale never before witnessed by American forces. Saipan on July 9, 1944, saw civilians throw themselves from Banzai Cliff and Suicide Cliff at Marpi Point, with estimates ranging from 800 to 1,000 suicides in just those few days. Marine Jim Reed witnessed a father throwing his children, then his wife, then himself off a cliff, and dozens of Marines watched similar scenes play out while being unable to stop them. American forces deployed megaphones broadcasting assurances in Japanese, brought captured civilians to shout promises of good treatment, and attempted physical rescues at the cliff bases, but they couldn't stop the deaths, no matter what they tried. Japanese propaganda had convinced these civilians that Americans were monsters who would rape and torture them without mercy, while soldiers had distributed grenades and ordered suicides that left Americans watching helplessly. Some civilians chose to jump rather than surrender, while others were pushed. Children were thrown, and it became a horror that American forces were completely unprepared to confront mentally or emotionally. Saipan saw between 3,144 and 3,006 Americans killed, between 25,000 and 30,000 Japanese soldiers die, but the civilian death toll ranged between 8,000 and 22,000, with many of those being suicides. Both of Saipan's senior Japanese commanders, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito and Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the Pearl Harbor attack, committed ritual suicide on July 7th, before ordering the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. 4,000 Japanese troops attacked American positions for over 15 hours in what became a suicide charge on a massive scale. American forces counted 4,311 bodies in front of their positions when it was over, and the waste of human life for no military gain shocked even hardened combat veterans. Now I want to briefly mention the Battle of Guadalcanal, which lasted from August 1942 to February 1943, approximately 6 months, making it the longest campaign in the Pacific. Guadalcanal doesn't compete with Okinawa or Manila for total deaths, but it introduced American forces to an enemy they weren't prepared for at all: tropical disease that killed more efficiently than bullets. 2/3 of the 1st Marine Division was disabled by disease alone, and by December 1942, over 8,000 Marines had contracted malaria, 5 times more than combat casualties. The Japanese fared even worse, with 9,000 dying from disease and starvation versus 14,800 in combat, and they called it the Island of Death for reasons that had nothing to do with American firepower. Disease became the primary enemy on Guadalcanal, turning the jungle itself into a weapon more effective than any army. Iwo Jima, that famous 36-day battle for an 8-square-mile island, that gave us the iconic flag-raising photograph, saw ground temperatures reach between 86 and 122 degrees Fahrenheit because of the volcanic terrain. Marines slept only 1 hour at a time due to constant Japanese infiltration, and Japanese soldiers would call out corpsmen in English to ambush medics attempting to help wounded Marines, turning mercy into a death sentence. Iwo Jima produced 2,148 documented combat fatigue cases among the 6,181 Americans and between 17,845 and 18,375 Japanese defenders who died there. No civilian casualties occurred because the Japanese had evacuated the civilian population before the battle, making it purely a military engagement without the added horror of civilian deaths. But the psychiatric toll across all these battles was cumulative and permanent. These weren't isolated incidents that soldiers could recover from after a few weeks of rest. Every major Pacific battle produced hundreds or thousands of men who simply couldn't function anymore. The human mind has limits, and these battles found them, exceeded them, and kept pushing until something broke that couldn't be fixed. Now we come to the most consequential legacy of Okinawa and its direct influence on President Truman's decision to use atomic weapons against Japan. June 15, 1945, while Okinawa was still raging, saw the Joint War Plans Committee submit estimates for invading the Japanese home islands that projected 40,000 American dead and 150,000 wounded. Other estimates ranged as high as 2 million American casualties, including 500,000 killed, and those weren't wild guesses, but calculations based on what was happening on Okinawa in real time. The United States manufactured 500,000 Purple Hearts in anticipation of the invasion of Japan. 500,000 Purple Hearts prepared in advance, and the military is still using that stockpile today, almost 80 years later, because the invasion never happened. That's how many casualties they expected when they looked at Okinawa and projected that across the Japanese home islands. Truman told his advisors he hoped to prevent an Okinawa from one end of Japan to another, and military planners looked at what happened on that island. 1/3 of the civilian population dead, fanatical resistance, mass suicides, months of grinding combat, and projected that across Tokyo, Osaka, and Kyoto. They imagined defending every city with civilians armed with bamboo spears, taught to fight to the death. Millions of Japanese deaths, hundreds of thousands of American deaths, and combat that would last into 1946 or beyond. Historian Victor Davis Hanson argued that Okinawa's horrific casualties convinced American strategists they needed an alternative to direct invasion, and the atomic bombs became that alternative. The atomic bombs killed between 129,000 and 226,000 people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined, while Okinawa alone killed 240,000 to 250,000 people. Historian George Pfeiffer called Okinawa the site of the largest land-sea-air battle in history, and it became a preview of what invading Japan would look like, that American leadership decided they couldn't accept. We can debate the morality of that decision and argue about whether there were alternatives, but we can't deny the direct line between what happened on Okinawa and what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki 6 weeks later. So after examining all these battles, how do we answer the question of which was the worst? By total deaths, Okinawa stands alone, with 240,000 to 250,000 people dead, 1/3 of the civilian population killed, more deaths than both atomic bombs combined, the longest sustained combat operation in the Pacific, the most psychiatric casualties, both commanding generals killed, and the direct catalyst for the atomic bomb decision. By deliberate civilian atrocity, Manila represents the darkest chapter, with over 100,000 civilians systematically murdered in 28 days through methods that official American investigators said surpassed what cannibals in the lowest strata of life could conceive. The 14th Corps Inspector General documented atrocities that defy credence, and his reports still make difficult reading today. By soldier suffering relative to strategic gain, Peleliu stands as warfare's most tragic miscalculation, with the highest casualty rate of any amphibious assault, at over 40% for an island that provided negligible strategic military advantage. Admiral Halsey had recommended canceling the operation. He was ignored, and over 2,000 Americans died for an unnecessary objective. By environmental and disease impact, Guadalcanal disabled 2/3 of the 1st Marine Division through malaria alone, 5 times more than combat casualties, turning disease into the primary weapon of that campaign. By psychological impact, Okinawa again leads with 26,000 documented combat fatigue cases, but every major Pacific battle left thousands of men permanently scarred in ways that statistics can't capture. Eugene Sledge wrote about Peleliu that something in me died, and that wasn't poetry or dramatic language, that was truth spoken plainly by a man who understood what had been taken from him. Historians overwhelmingly identify Okinawa as the Pacific theater's worst battle, and the consensus isn't even close when you look at academic assessments and military histories. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the Pacific Fleet commander, made a famous observation about Iwo Jima when he said, "Uncommon valor was a common virtue." He was talking about the extraordinary courage shown by ordinary Marines, and that assessment applies to every Pacific battle, including Okinawa, Manila, Peleliu, Saipan, and Guadalcanal. But Eugene Sledge's assessment from Peleliu provides the other side of that truth, with his statement that something in me died, because valor and trauma aren't opposites that cancel each other out. They coexist in the same men who can be extraordinarily brave while being destroyed by what they're forced to do and witness, and nobody who came home from these battles came home whole. The Pacific War's worst battles didn't just kill bodies, they killed souls and produced trauma that echoed through generations of survivors, through the families of the dead, through the Okinawan civilians who lost 1/3 of their population, and through the Filipino civilians who watched their city destroyed and their families murdered. The cornerstone of Peace Memorial on Okinawa doesn't distinguish between Japanese, American, Allied, or Okinawan names when it lists them all together. 240,046 names as of 2023. Every single one represents a person who died on that island or died from wounds received there, and the memorial treats them equally in death, even when they were enemies in life. Manila has its own memorials, though they're less well known internationally, and the Manila massacre remains overshadowed by other Pacific theater atrocities, even though it shouldn't be. 100,000 civilians systematically murdered in 28 days demands remembrance equal to any other atrocity of the war. Peleliu has a memorial too, visited by relatively few people each year, and those Marines who died there died for an island that historians agree didn't need to be taken. That doesn't diminish their sacrifice. It actually makes it more tragic because they gave everything for nothing. So let's return to where we started. This is the story of the Pacific Theater's deadliest battle, the Battle of Okinawa, which killed between 240,000 and 250,000 people in 82 days and directly influenced the decision to use atomic weapons rather than invade Japan. But it's also the story of Manila, where over 100,000 civilians were systematically murdered in 28 days through atrocities that shocked even battle-hardened American soldiers. And it's the story of Peleliu, where Marines suffered the highest casualty rate of any Pacific amphibious assault for an objective military planners now agree was strategically unnecessary. The determination of the Pacific's worst battle depends on moral weighting that each person has to decide for themselves. Do you count total deaths, civilian atrocities, soldier suffering, or strategic futility? Because each answer gives you a different battle at the top of that terrible list. But what unites these battles is their revelation of warfare's capacity for total dehumanization. These weren't just military operations conducted according to rules and objectives. They were catastrophes that destroyed everyone they touched, including soldiers, civilians, victors, and vanquished alike. The generation that fought these battles is almost gone now, with the youngest World War II veterans in their late 90s. Soon, there will be no one left who saw these things firsthand, and the memories will be preserved only in documents, photographs, and memorials that try to capture what can't really be captured. But the lessons remain for anyone willing to learn them. The Okinawans who lost 1/3 of their population, the Filipinos who watched their capital destroyed, the Marines who returned from Peleliu with something dead inside them, and the Japanese civilians who chose death over surrender because propaganda convinced them the alternative was worse, all have something to teach us. These battles proved that warfare at its worst consumes everything, not just lives, but humanity itself. The casualty numbers tell part of the story, the mass suicides tell part of the story, and the systematic murder tells part of the story, but the full story is simpler and more terrible than any single statistic. War destroys not just who we are, but what we are, and that's why decades later, we're still trying to understand which Pacific Theater battle was the worst, because they all were just in different ways. Choosing between them forces us to confront questions we'd rather not answer about what human beings are capable of doing to each other when military necessity and human cost collide. The Battle of Okinawa killed more people than both atomic bombs combined, and that's not an argument for or against those weapons, but just a fact that should make us pause. Consider what happens when you trap hundreds of thousands of people on an island 60 miles long where civilians have nowhere to run and soldiers have orders to fight to the death. And you begin to understand why this battle changed, how America fought wars and ended this one. That's the worst battle of the Pacific War, not because of one single factor, but because it combined almost everything terrible about Pacific combat into 82 days of concentrated horror that nobody who experienced it ever forgot. Thank you for watching Retry.